Hello and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Fredrick Addia, and I'm a postgraduate associate at the Environmental Leadership and Training Initiative, or ELTI. ELTI is an initiative of the Yale School of the Environment focused on capacity development for conserving and restoring tropical forest landscapes. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Emmy Nicholson, ELTI's Online Training Associate, and Abby York, ELTI's Programs Administrator. We are excited to welcome you to the third section of our four-part webinar series titled The Evolving Role of Biodiversity Credits in Global Conservation. On April 3rd, we talked about biodiversity credits market scope and demands. And last week, we discussed the theme biodiversity credit project design. Today, we will talk about practical considerations that inform biodiversity markets. And next week, that is April 24th, we will wrap up with monitoring and verification of biodiversity credit projects. So as I already mentioned, today, we will be discussing the practical considerations that inform biodiversity markets with two panelists. We have Dr. Eli Fenichel, the Knobloch Family Professor of Natural Resource Economics at Yale University, and Ryan Sarsfield, Senior Advisor on Biodiversity Markets at Environmental Policy Innovation Center. So here is an outline of this session's agenda. First, you hear each presenter's pre-recorded talk. In order to have subtitles, prepare for variability in internet connectivity, and edit for time, our speakers have kindly pre-recorded their talks. After both presentations, a live Q&A will follow. Finally, we will close with a few announcements right before 10 a.m. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Eli Fenichel. Dr. Fenichel's innovative research bridges natural science, dynamical systems, and economics. He holds a PhD from Michigan State University and joined Yale University in 2012, where he is now the Knobloch Family Professor of Natural Resource Economics. Between 2021 and 2023, he also served as the Assistant Director for Natural Resource Economics and Accounting at the White House Office of Science and Policy, Office of Science and Technology Policy. His research approaches natural science management and sustainability as a portfolio management problem by considering natural resource as a form of capital. Dr. Fenichel has over 100 publications and have been cited more than 6,000 times. In 2024, he published a paper on blended academic insights for biodiversity and conservation finance. Dr. Fenichel, before our team gets the video up, can you please unmute your microphone and activate your camera to say hi to our audience?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Thank you for having me today. It's a real pleasure to get to talk to you all about biodiversity credit markets. I've put biodiversity in one color and credit markets in the other because I think we want to talk about these two things slightly disconnected and then bring them back together. I also want to start off by saying that I think biodiversity conservation is a really important issue. It's a defining issue of our time. And I think the use of markets to manage natural resources and climate and other things is a really creative and powerful tool. So let's talk a little bit about tradable permit obligation markets. You could say credit markets, but I think credit is really about how we do the accounting. What we're talking about here is tradable permit markets or tradable obligation markets. Markets are wonderful. Look, I'm an economist. Markets are wonderful. One of the things I love about the idea of markets is the normative philosophy behind a market is everything is voluntary. And if everything is voluntary, then no one can be made worse off by the trade. So a market has to, tautologically, has to make everybody involved better off. Certainly, if people are excluded from the market, we can have conversations about how this works in the real world. But the philosophy is actually really striking and powerful. And that's one of the great things about markets. Okay, so a cap and trade market or an allocate and trade market has two parts. It's got a cap or an allocation, which is really about setting an aggregate goal. Okay, It's about saying we want to achieve this much carbon emission, or we want to conserve that much biodiversity. These are usually broken down into two kinds of markets. There's compliance. So how that allocation gets set, you can have sort of compliance markets. And these are usually with compliance with a law or a regulation, perhaps some sort of contract, where maybe a government agency comes in and says, we're going to cap the total amount of, I don't know, fish you can catch. You guys figure out who gets to catch them, okay? The other one is a voluntary market, but really what for these voluntary markets to work, what you have to have is something that's kind of like contractually binding commitments. That is, a bunch of firms say we're going to hit these commitments. Those commitments to varying degrees can be obligatory for them to hit. Europe has set some standards. In the US, there's a question if a firm says it's going to do something, where it says it, whether or not it becomes like binding to by shareholders. And then they go out and like, we've got to do this thing that fits in what we said we're going to do. Okay, that's CAP. Trade is about assigning the obligations for meeting the aggregate goal to the least cost individuals through a voluntary mechanism. That is, the idea here is if one firm, if it's more expensive to do something in one firm and less expensive to do it in the other, you want to do it in the less expensive firm. And overall, you want to meet the like environmental goal jointly across the two firms. It doesn't really matter what individual firms do in terms of biodiversity or carbon or other things we might care about. What it cares about is the aggregate outcome. And of course, we want the people who can do things at lowest cost to do them, because of course we want to save resources to do other great things. Environmental markets have actually been hugely successful. The very first one was actually for phasing out lead gasoline and lead additives in markets. This was originally initiated, I believe, by Richard Nixon, and really came into like full power under the Reagan administration here in the US. This is basically really a permit banking system, but it's a form of sort of cap and trade. Tradable permits for fisheries, sometimes called catch shares, have been amazingly successful at reducing overfishing and getting fishermen buy-in. The SO2 and acid rain markets in the US were so successful that basically the markets fell apart, in part because nobody wanted to buy any more permits because they incentivized firms to reduce their emissions so much. It got so cheap to do it. Carbon trading has actually been really successful. The challenge with things like the ETUS and other regulatory cap and trade systems, the problem, or where people tend to criticize these, is the caps tend not to be set very stringently, but the trading bit seems to work okay. Another area that gets mixed reviews is wetland mitigation banking, and this is probably the closest thing we've seen so far to biodiversity credit markets. But there's some key conditions for success that fall out of all of these great things. One is that you have contract enforceability. So if you are working in a part of the world or in a sector that really it's hard to just enforce contracts in general, you know, cap and trade or credit markets, they're not going to work any better because you're dealing with this backdrop of just not having credible contract enforcement. You need a right to affect the unit change of a well-defined and somewhat common stock. That is, you need to be able to, whatever you're trading, it needs to be from like the same pool of stuff, and we need to know what it's talking about. This is why the catch shares programs work really well. So like in the US, there's one for halibut in Alaska. We draw a box or a polygon around where this halibut stock is. We know what a halibut is. People know what they're talking about, right? And fishermen who are fishing there can actually like catch a single halibut. They're actually quite good at it. And then you need a sufficient number of easily discoverable partners to trade with. This is how you get, so the way these things work, the reason, what the markets do is they create prices. So we trade things at a price. You go to the store, you buy a hamburger, it's like whatever, $8. You know what the price is. That price is conveying information. It comes about from lots of buyers and sellers negotiating what that price should be. If it's really costly for them to find each other, that price is going to not provide as much information, right? If there's not a partner at all, there's not going to be a price. So let's pivot now and talk about biodiversity for a moment, and then we'll put the two things back together. Convention of biodiversity defines biodiversity as the variability among living organisms from all sources, including inter alia, terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and ecological complexes in which they are a part. This includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. So, right, see, Convention Biodiversity, this is a bunch of international diplomats trying to understand the scientific literature and building an inclusive definition. Seems perfectly reasonable. David Suzuki, who's often credited with like coining the phrase biodiversity, defines it as the totality of genes, species, and ecosystems of a region. Kind of says the same thing as CBD, but like in way fewer words. That's how diplomats roll. I think it's Anna Chow is probably one of the like leading current thinkers on how you would think about measuring biodiversity within the ecological literature. And she says that biodiversity, the variety and variability among living organisms and the ecological complexes in which they occur. Okay, so these are all pretty complicated definitions, way more complicated than a molecule of carbon or a pound of halibut. Biodiversity finance literature. So that literature seldom gives a clear definition of what biodiversity is. When I talk to people who are deep in that practitioner space, basically it's implicitly everything having to do with nature and the environment that is not explicitly connected to climate change. Kind of a big gap between like the practitioners who might be trading in biodiversity markets and what like maybe ecologists or diplomats think it is. But the key thing that brings all these together is that they all agree that biodiversity is a mix of stuff with no clear singular unit. This is great from a diplomat's perspective because it can be all things to all people. It's really hard from a trader's perspective because when you're trading a unit of biodiversity, what are you actually trading? So let me try and put these two things together. If biodiversity is an index of stuff, it has problems. It has problems. It might be very useful for certain kinds of ecological studies. It might be very useful as a concept to talk about things, but to measure it, it has some problems. It does not have well-defined units that everyone agrees on, and this is very hard to get to. Most existing biodiversity indices, what they do is they take they're what we call many-to-one mappings. They take things with lots of many species, and they come up with a single index number or a single index measurement. This cannot provide a unique price. So we have a paper in PNAS from last year where we prove this mathematically. This is really problematic for traders and for conservation finance or for biodiversity credit markets if we're thinking about biodiversity as such. Diversity in most cases is what we would call a second moment. So you can think about, if you remember back to your statistics course, we think of the mean as the first moment, and we think of the variance as the second moment. Diversity is really about the second moment. So we're already talking about a portfolio. So we need to be thinking about like, how do we blend and trade portfolios if we're actually talking about trading biodiversity, as opposed to credits for specific, say, pounds of halibut or something. And then the services associated with biodiversity can be very localized. That is, conserving an owl in Connecticut is not conserving the same thing as conserving an owl in West Virginia, is not the same thing as conserving maybe even the same species of owl, let's say somewhere in Europe, right? And so the question is like, how big can you get these markets? Becomes a real challenge. So, and this last bit really goes to that notion that you need to be able to find a sufficient number of credible trading partners at low cost. So let's say biodiversity is just a catch-all for a set of markets, not a single market, but a set of markets for either conservation actions or like well-defined species. So then you have to say like, what's being offset? So there have been talk of things like markets for whaling permits. This could work, right? Like we have these tradable fisheries markets. If you had markets for whaling permits, but maybe you allow conservationists to buy into these markets as well as whalers, then you let conservationists, and so conservationists can like retire whaling permits. That seems like we can talk about specific stocks of whales and specific oceans. Maybe it works. Talking about bird conservation, we need to be a lot more specific. And then like, what action do you get to take if you buy a permit? Like what either obligation or right does it give you? And every permit has an obligation and right side. And then I think there's this big challenge of, can we discover buyers and sellers easily? Do they agree on the units? Are are the contracts that they're working under enforceable? And really, are there enough buyers and sellers to get the efficiency gains from having a market? So economists call this a thick market when you have enough buyers and sellers. And so they're actually trading because like there's costs to just like managing a website, or maybe you're trading permits or having people auditing them, and all, like there are some costs of running a market. And the advantage is you get these like really big cost savings gains because you allocate the obligations to those with the least cost of covering them. But if you can't find buyers and sellers, then you just have a cap. You don't have a cap and trade. You don't get the benefits of a market. I think one of the other things that concerns me with biodiversity markets is in some of these markets, we use trading ratios. That is, so some air pollution markets, it's been like said, like maybe we should use these trading ratios where air pollution in rural, you can have more pollution in a rural region than you can. So 1 unit of pollution in, say, offsetting one pollution in an urban region, you can have more pollution in a rural region. And simply the reason is there's fewer people. And so like the cost of that pollution is less because it infects fewer people's lungs. Say what you will about that, this is the whole idea of trading ratios. This is very likely to happen if we think about, rather than like a biodiversity portfolio trade, but trading individual species. What's going to happen when one species trades at $100,000 more than another, or even the same species in another location? What I suspect might happen is we might start worrying about fairness or other things going on in this market. And all of a sudden you start putting these side constraints on the market. And again, you erode the efficiencies of that market. And I think this is something that people haven't really grappled with who've been advocating for biodiversity credit markets. It seems to me that the biodiversity credit market whole idea right now is very supply side driven. There's lots of people who would like to sell biodiversity credits. I have not talked to as many buyers of potential biodiversity credit markets. So while I think that markets are a wonderful tool to deal with public good problems, there are some uses within the broad scope of what we could call biodiversity. I think that we need to be more specific than just talking about biodiversity. We need to be talking about like minke whales in the Atlantic Ocean. We need to be talking, about specific species or ecosystems, what's being traded, and then really, are there enough people to participate in a market that you could, enough traders? So I think that I've heard some pushback to biodiversity markets, but I think the real reasons are like, can you get the market design right so that it actually delivers on its promise? Thank you very much for listening to me today. I'm really glad you all are so interested in this topic because I do think it's a very important one for us to get our heads around. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Fenichel, for your presentation. We'll move on to Ryan's presentation. I would like to introduce Ryan just a little bit. Ryan joined the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, or EPIC, to build markets for biodiversity credits in the US and abroad. Following many years focused on balancing habitat conservation and resource extraction in international land use. With EPIC's expertise in wetlands, habitats, and species market, he is working with biodiversity credit developers, investors, and landowners to make investing in nature a reality. Previously, he had private sector engagements in Latin America for Global Forest Watch and at the World Resource Institute, as well as time at the Inter-American Development Bank, WWF, the National Wildlife Federation, and the forest carbon industry. Ryan holds a BSc in biology from Cornell University and a master's in environmental science from Yale School of the Environment. Before we work on getting your video up, Ryan, can you kindly unmute your microphone, activate your camera, and say hi to our audience?
Thanks, Fred. Good morning, everybody, at least for those for whom it's morning. And thanks for joining us today. All right. Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you for this presentation and chat today. I'm going to talk about practical considerations for biodiversity markets. It's a pretty wide topic. And what I want to focus on are some of the things we often hear that are maybe doubts or things posed as barriers or challenges to the market, sometimes by people who are advocates, sometimes by potential critics. But I want to kind of talk through some frequently asked questions or frequently discussed debates and issues, things like that. So let's jump into it. All right, these are some of the challenges and barriers. These are things that I hear all the time. I'm sure some of you listening probably think along these lines in some cases or have some of these same questions. And I'm going to go through them one by one and kind of talk through what my perspective is on this and how I think it might affect the development of the new markets. So number one, the idea that these markets are brand new and untested. There's this idea that it's totally a novel thing, that it's a kind of carbon market, but even newer, more cutting edge. It is in a way, but I'm going to get into that a little bit. Number two is about measurement. Measurement being too complex, too impossible, that an ecological system could never be reduced to something that's actually useful in an ecological market. We're going to talk about that. Number three, this idea of fungibility, which can be interpreted in more than one way. And I've put both of these ideas here juxtaposed against each other because it's kind of funny how, depending on your position, you might think that fungibility is absolutely necessary or absolutely problematic, but we'll get into that. And lastly, we're going to talk about offsets or credits. What do we really mean? Partly a terminology question, but where do we see this as an ethical question, and how does that connect to demand? Because these are big issues swirling around in these discussions, and I think it's worth kind of addressing head on. All right. So let's talk about that first one. Biodiversity credits and the markets are brand new and untested. Okay, so this is one kind of myth, and we stress this all the time here at EPIC, that these markets have been around for a very long time. We often think of these as biodiversity markets, given the name of them, but they're often habitat-based markets. And habitat-based markets like the U.S. wetland mitigation and conservation banking markets are huge. It's been around for decades. They're building off of legislation from the 70s, although they developed over the last 20 to 25 years. And it's a $3.5 billion market. And strangely, even in the US, but often internationally, these markets are not particularly well known given their size and their effectiveness, but they function basically as biodiversity credit markets. They do make use of the mitigation hierarchy, so they're avoiding impacts, they're reducing their impacts, and where the impact is residual, that's where they're using credits to offset it. They do ensure additionality and permanence. These are often carried out in kind of different ways than we think of carbon crediting or some of the methodologies for new biodiversity crediting, but they're there. And lastly, they really do encourage the avoidance of impact. And they do actually steer funding into restoration and probably reservation too. So all it is to say, we know how to do this. This is not some exotic, wild, crazy idea. It's a little bit old hat, but at the very least, we do know how to do this. And while we're looking at the carbon markets for wisdom, what to do, what not to do in some cases, we have other markets to learn from. And these kinds of compensation markets already exist in the US, they exist in Colombia, and they exist in England for biodiversity net gain, and they're popping up and are used to different degrees in other parts of the world as well. All right, measurement. This is complex, but I would say measurement is not too complex. For anybody who's studied ecology, you know that ecological systems are infinitely complex. What can you possibly measure in an ecosystem such that it can capture holistically or capture enough of the system to be useful in this market? And I stress that phrasing because I think it's important to think of it that way. What is good enough to work? It's not attempting to have a completely thorough, holistic measure of everything in the system. And any system that uses offsets and compensation will deal with this problem that you're not sufficiently replacing what you might have damaged. As we structure these things are sufficiently built to accommodate that imperfection. But we get to this point, we see that in reality, there's a lot of workable and sufficient ways to measure change in a natural system. It's not about getting it perfect because none of these systems will be perfect. And ecologists are doing the good work they do, and they will disagree on what's best and what's most appropriate, which indicators are really capturing the ecosystem best. Our understory plants are a really good indicator. Are insects a good indicator? Migratory birds. What about soil fungi, for example? All these different things have arguments going for them about why they're fundamental. And the fact that there isn't complete consensus doesn't mean that this isn't a workable system. It makes me think of carbon markets where there's a lot of imprecision. There's a lot of discussion about new and better ways to measure carbon, above ground carbon, below ground carbon, and so on. That doesn't mean that carbon markets can't function, because they do function with the tools they have. And those markets and biodiversity markets will keep learning and refining what they're doing. That's part of the process. So the idea then is to have measurements that are good enough to ensure integrity and ensure outcomes. And I would say that is absolutely feasible now, and it's only going to get better. All right, fungibility. This is often talked about because it's such a singular difference to most of us between carbon markets and biodiversity markets. Carbon, in principle, can be one single global market. It's one atmosphere, and an avoided emission of carbon or a removal of a ton of carbon should be, in principle, the same everywhere on Earth. It's just not the same with biodiversity. But we see this from different ways depending on the perspectives, the voices in the room. Some folks that want to commodify biodiversity, and I don't personally agree with that, they think that there should be fungibility, that having the fungibility is essential to create secondary trading, to be able to financialize things properly, to have globalized investment going into these markets, because that is one of the routes that carbon was able to scale up. I think that's probably not the best way to look at it. We should be thinking of fungibility as something important, but only at the local ecologically equivalent scale when it's used for compensation. So that is to say, if you are comparing the credit to the impact, that comparison must be done ecologically, locally, geographically locally, and overseen by ecologists. So when you hear someone say, well, we can't trade a chimpanzee for a jaguar, of course not. That's not what we're aiming to do. The idea is where you have local impact, you should also be investing locally. And so anything used as compensation or offsets, whether formally or informally, and I'll get into that distinction in a second, those should in fact be done in an ecologically equivalent local way. Investment from afar is helpful. That's one of the arguments for building the market in a globalized way. But I would argue that you don't need to have fungibility to have investment. And we see that in the US wetland mitigation markets, which regularly get very large investments from foreign pension funds and investors looking for good, reliable returns. But it's not because each of these markets has the same unit, far from it. That said, distant compensation, as I mentioned, is not what we're looking for. So these markets can be globalized in the sense that they can be invested in from afar, but they should not be traded across borders when you're talking about compensation. And then finally, this idea of a single universal unit. There's a lot of discussion about this. Some people think of it as essential. I tend to think of it as not necessary and probably impractical. These are going to be built from distinct indicators. Every ecosystem is going to be different, even if it's the same ecosystem type. And credit prices will also reflect the local cost of restoration and preservation, which means that even if you have a single universal unit, the comparability will be very difficult. That credit price difference is useful in carbon, but perhaps not as much for biodiversity because it's not a single global fungible market that we're trying to compensate across and find the lowest possible ones. We should have credits that sufficiently fund the restoration and preservation at the local level. That's what we're aiming for. All right, I'd say the best for last here, offset or credit. Now, this gets argued about in terms of terminology. What is an offset? What is a credit? And in some circles, the word offset and the word credit are considered to be quite distinct and not overlapping at all. I quite intentionally will sometimes blur those lines for the following reason, that credits, when they're not built into a formal regulatory system, are nonetheless very frequently, and I would say predominantly, used for something resembling compensation, right? So an offset needs to have, this is my second bullet there, a formal offset needs to have formal regulation. You need to have a regulator deeming what is sufficiently equivalent and when an offset is a good offset and how that counts, and therefore what claims can a buyer of a credit make about their investment and what that says about the compensation for impact that they had. All of this is tied up into philosophical arguments about whether or not you can actually put a price on biodiversity. And when you do put a price on biodiversity, does that simply facilitate the destruction of it? That makes it simply another cost of doing business to those that might externalize their costs. And, you know, I use the word proper valuation there. That's in part because we have to create these systems correctly for them to work. There's examples out there where it has not worked as well. But if our options are to disconnect credits from impact or to tie them at the hip to impact with a compensatory system, I think the latter is a much better idea because it makes it costly to destroy biodiversity. That's the problem, is that it's too cheap. Often it's free to destroy biodiversity. And we want to make that associated with a cost. And when that cost is invoked, it should only be under certain circumstances following the mitigation hierarchy. And the money should be used thoughtfully and constructively to actually invest in restoration and preservation. So we have to build these chunks of the market together in a way that they interact correctly, that the incentives are set correctly. But this idea that we should disconnect offsets, disconnect the idea of credits from the idea of offsets, I think is very wrong-headed and shifts the whole agenda back to, I would argue, the status quo, which is that there's a lot of interest in investing in nature through philanthropy, through the NGO world, civil society, but it is disconnected from the impact, and the impact is, if not the biggest, one of the biggest problems we have to deal with in this space. So let's connect them to each other. Let's create a system that actually penalizes through a cost causing the impact in the first place and drive that funding into productive uses. So the last piece here is disclosure biodiversity impacts is growing. So this is just as the route was followed for carbon. As companies disclose their impacts, they develop a better sense internally and hopefully externally through more transparency on what their footprint actually is. Having gone through that process with carbon, they saw that, oh, we actually have a footprint, we can address it this way, we can avoid some impacts, we can reduce some impacts, and there will be residual impacts inevitably. What do they do about those residual impacts? And that has driven a lot of the demand in the voluntary carbon market. And I think that is essentially where a lot of this is going for the voluntary biodiversity markets. Even when the regulation is not in place to call something a formal offset, compensation, sort of an informal offset, that's really what's driving demand. And we shouldn't be blind to that. In fact, I think we should very specifically aim for it and meet that demand with credits that can actually show a evidence-based, third-party verified, high integrity unit of biodiversity uplift. That's what we're really trying to make, and that will create successful outcomes for nature. So that's where we are, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Ryan, for the presentation. Thank you both for the talks and also answering most of the questions in the Q&A feature. I'm really loving today's session because it's been very interactive in the Q&A feature. So I kind of have some questions, but before then, I would like to let you know that we have about 20 to 25 minutes for the Q&A. Yeah. My first question is going to go to Dr. Eli Fenichel. And although this question has already been answered in the Q&A feature, I would like to re-echo it and know your perspective. So we all believe and understand that markets are amazing, it's wonderful, but when you look at markets such as biodiversity markets and other nature markets that are very localized, how do indigenous people and locals tend to benefit from these markets?
So markets only work if you have something to trade in the market, right? So I think if you have one of the challenges we see with some of these markets is that they're half measures. They don't act, they exclude people, and I think that's what the question is when people are excluded from the market. During the SO2 markets, there was like a big hoo-ha that there was a kindergarten class in Chicago that had a child who had asthma. So the kids all brought in dollars and like bought and retired like a ton of SO2. And there was like this complaint that like this isn't like this is wrong, like they shouldn't be able to do that. This has been a problem in the ITQ markets for fisheries, the fisheries catch shares markets. That's how markets are meant to work, right? Like if you actually want these markets to work and we want to equate, demand with supply, if people, we shouldn't be questioning why people are demanding something. So if indigenous groups say like, look, we want to retire this thing and we care about, I shouldn't be questioning why we should be buying, why they should be buying it. If they should be allowed to enter, right? So we do have a series of rules that have popped up in our catch shares markets that exclude environmental NGOs, right? There have been from like buying and retiring allocation. These are market distortions. These are adding more market distortion. And so the challenge I see with so there was a really good question in the chat. And the challenge I see is like you've got a few different things that have to come together. And you can imagine that like a space. And as you like, okay, we need to worry about local effects. So that's going to cut out part of the square. We need to worry about getting enough people in. That's going to cut out a part of the square. If we go in and add more constraints, we're just cutting out that square. And the size of that square is going to be related to how well the market portion of this instrument works. And so I think some of the concern and some of the questions I'm seeing in the question and answer are like, there's the market and trading bit that's all about getting efficiency and getting a specified result at least costs. And then there's the overall target. And the overall target, some of the issues with these are like we've set the overall targets too relaxed, or we've set them too stringently. Or we don't think they're actually providing the service. Ryan was talking about the importance of the wetlands mitigation banks, and I think they are the best model for thinking what a biodiversity market would look like. And there are a lot of people, I've had students work on these, where it's like, the complaint is what you wind up doing is moving wetlands from urban, suburban core areas to the headwaters, which might have some hydrological benefits, but then you're losing certain services that the wetlands might be providing in those core areas. And so there are like, what is being traded, how fungible, the fungibility bit matters. And then the question is who's allowed to participate? But at the end of the day, if you have nothing to bring to a market, it's not going to help you. I don't think that's true for most indigenous groups. I think instead what we've done is we've drawn the rules of the market too narrowly to exclude people. And that's like anti-capitalist. And I'm a capitalist, so I'll just say that, and you can pick on me.
All right. Thanks so much, Dr. Fenichel, for answering that question. My next question is going to be directed towards Ryan. So, Ryan, we would like to know how biodiversity baselines account for changes in seasonal changes and successional changes in ecological communities. So, for instance, birds are very good indicators of biodiversity, and we have migratory birds. So how do we consider those in biodiversity measurements?
It's a really good question. It doesn't have a simple answer. If you ask a grad student who did one field season in a place, whether or not they captured enough data in that summer to show all the interannual variation, I think they would usually say no, they haven't. That said, there has to be some period of time when it's acceptable to take baseline measurements and use them. So we couldn't have, for instance, like a 5-year study that is used as the baseline for a project just to get going. So there's a happy medium in there. And some things I think can be measured reasonably well if you go out and measure understory plant diversity or something like that. If you're not otherwise having had a fire or a drought, you can capture a lot of what's there. If you think otherwise the conditions are within the normal range of variation, can you capture one season's worth of migratory birds? Is that enough? It's hard to say. This is something ecologists can debate about how much data should you have to capture in the baseline, and then how much data would you need to capture over time to accurately show the change. And connected to your question is how much variation in nature, already exacerbated by climate, will affect how measurements are made over the years of the project and show how much uplift there is. And is there additionality if, for instance, you've done all the normal good work, you've managed as best as you possibly could, but then you get a historically unprecedented fire moving through your forest? Are those credits null and void, right? So these questions can be dealt with through different market mechanisms. Carbon market used buffer mechanisms. The wetland mitigation market in the US uses kind of mixed approach. So if you are restoring a stream and a flood moves in and destroys what you did in the first year or two, maybe trees you planted aren't even there anymore, they were washed downstream, the regulators will say, yeah, you have to go back in and do some repairs and get things back to a certain level. But after a certain point, once that variation, once the level of project creation has been established and approved, there's an acceptance of variability later on where nature can be fickle, it's got constant variation, it still needs to be managed for the long term. But everywhere on Earth, we're getting, historically unprecedented, statistically improbable fires and dry seasons and floods and so on. And that is just going to be acceptable within these markets and wouldn't necessarily render credits worthless. But we have to keep investing in these places despite the variability, even if things might go awry sometimes, right?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So the next question is for both of you. And I am taking this from the Q&A feature. And it is the person is asking if trading and markets are really working, why is everything going, or I should say living planet index, going in the wrong direction? And where are we internally generating money for these markets? And if monetized profits is what we are working towards, how does nature provide that without extraction? Ryan, would you like to go first?
Well, there's a lot in that question. There was another question I already answered about, the degree of success of carbon markets, and I'll take it to be asking also about biodiversity markets. If they can work so well, why do we have the problems we have? But we shouldn't confuse efforts to fix a problem with the problem itself. And I understand, I'm somewhat sympathetic to people who find that, the market-based modern economies and globalized market-based economies have driven so much of the loss of biodiversity around the earth. So naturally, sometimes people will say, well, that is clearly the problem rather than the solution. If you're not happy with capitalism, I'm not saying that the person asking this is necessarily saying this, but often there's a resistance to markets and capitalism in some of these discussions. So the idea that you can use markets to fix it sounds improbable, but we know that it can work. And if I look at it as an option that is accessible to us, that can work, and it is about, as I said in the recording, actually putting a price on the impact and causing the destruction of biodiversity to be costly. Because the way our system works, without having a revolution in our economies in the US and everywhere else in the world, we're kind of stuck with this system in some variation as it is now. And so I'd rather be using a tool that we know works and making it costly to destroy biodiversity and channeling those costs into effective restoration and preservation, and having real outcomes for nature that actually disincentivizes destruction and encourages restoration. So that's what I think is the realm of the possible. But the degree of the mess we're in with climate and the loss of biodiversity is not caused by, these relatively small nature markets, relatively small carbon markets. They're caused by our, economic activity as a whole in our global economy. And if anyone has a solution to that, we'd love to hear that. But in the meantime, let's use what we have.
Thanks, Ryan. Dr. Fenichel?
So I think there is a lot, and I agree with a lot of what Ryan just said. Again, what I'll say is, like, don't confuse the cap with the trade. And that the markets themselves, like, they either work or they don't. That is, either there's enough trading partners where you're actually getting the efficiency of the market, or you're not. And usually when you're not, it's either the cap is so stringent that everyone's just doing it, or it's cheap and people would have done it, or the cap, like we might see in the complaints about the European carbon markets, is like the cap's just too loose relative to what people think carbon reduction should be. But I would take like a much stronger pushback on the premise, right? So if you think about when do we start getting globalized trade and globalized markets, we're really thinking post-World War II, as we start to see the integration of the global economy and more market-based management of the world. So what have we seen since the end of World War II? Despite the poverty in the world, we have seen large swaths of the planet move from extreme poverty to at least like middle income status. We have seen declines in childhood mortality across the world. We have seen increased opportunities for many. One could even question, is part of the reason we have so much despair is that we're seeing like this decline in, like, okay, children are living because we've seen declines in child mortality, but now maybe we're not, like, haven't developed the institutions to support like the adults that have come from that, like, childhood survival. I think there's a lot of concerns. There are a lot of errors in the way we do accounting, in the way we do measurement of the economy. It's what I spend most of my time thinking about. But the big push in the ability to trade, in the ability to work together to solve big problems, that's what markets do. Markets are not about making money. Markets are about finding cooperative solutions to hard problems and sharing risks and sharing returns.
Thanks so much, Dr. Fenichel. We have one question that has already been answered by Dr. Fenichel, but I would like to hear your perspective on it, Ryan. So if there are a trade-off between specificity and measurement of biodiversity token, so the question is there a trade-off between specificity and measurement of biodiversity token? Example, will in a given location and thickness of markets or potential buyers and sellers?
I'm not sure on the second part, but if I'm understanding the first part, the specificity of measurement, yeah, I think there's definitely a trade-off. We could measure every single aspect of an ecosystem and we still wouldn't capture all of it. And that's the science of ecology and field research. And we should do as much of that as we can. It doesn't work particularly well to have those kinds of intensive long-term studies built into these markets, right? But we can learn from those studies for these markets. So as I said in the recording, having enough such that we can capture the essential and create, if it's a restoration project, for example, create enough structure in the habitat and hopefully connectivity as well, such that the natural processes of succession, that getting more species being recruited to the site naturally, connectivity through seed dispersers, all these different mechanisms that can bring that back. If we can get the system to that stage and attract those animals, and be in a context where the natural processes can continue to restore the system, that's a good threshold. Now, what do we need to get to that? Do we need a certain number of trees? Do we need a closed tree canopy? Do we need structure? Do we need, fix the stream bed, things like that? All these structural habitat things can be part of it too. It's not that we need to measure every single aspect. We need to create things such that there is a scaffold that is legit, that has actual nature impacts that are evidence-based, and we can record those and share those, but also that the systems that naturally can build diversity back and create it as much of a holistic system that they're present as well.
Thanks, Ryan. So I will have one question for Professor and Dr. Fenichel too. So is it possible to build a market that just compensate natural resource managers for the cost of adapting evidence-based practices known to support biodiversity without relying on direct measurements of biodiversity outcomes, which are often variable, costly, and difficult to scale?
So I'll put some review papers somewhere in the chat, I guess. Most payments for ecosystem services, what get called payments for ecosystem services, that's actually what they do. They pay for practice, not for outcome, right? Sure, if you have enough people demanding that somebody takes some sort of action, fine. One of the challenges I see that I saw at COP16, when people talk about biodiversity credits or biodiversity markets, is the number of people hoping to sell into these markets. It just seems orders of magnitude higher than the number of people actually demanding the credits right now. And in part, that might be there might be money on the sidelines that's interested in conservation, but like wants a little more specificity. There was a really nice report on conservation finance broadly by Hank Paulson's Institute. And one of the things I love about the report's okay, but the quote right at the beginning is something really important, is like finance is how we allocate capital to get financial returns. Philanthropy is how we allocate those returns to do good stuff. And I'm paraphrasing, I might have blown the quote. I might not have it exact. So it's not really a credit market or a conservation finance mechanism if like I care about biodiversity and I just say, look, I'm willing to like give some money to have people manage differently that I think is a way of promoting biodiversity. That's philanthropy. Philanthropy is great. It's important. There's going to be problems. That's like kind of how we have to solve them. The credit, as I understand most folks thinking about the credit markets, they're thinking about these as conservation finance vehicles. That is, people want some private financial return. The buyers of these want some financial return. Maybe that's that they're thinking they're going to buy an obligation that is going to experience capital gains, and that they're going to be able to sell that. Maybe they're thinking that there is a series of dividends that are going to be paid. If you look at, I put in one of the responses a really nice paper by Carolyn Flammer and colleagues. She looks at the conservation finance book of a large bank and looks at what those projects actually look like. The projects she finds, if I remember correctly from her paper, they have to be paying with concessionary finance, that is with some blended philanthropy in something like an 11% return on investment. When the banks were funding these without concessionary finance, I think it was closer to 14%. Now, could you collateralize that and turn that into a tradable version of that fund? Probably. I'm not sure if that's the biodiversity credit markets that people that like Ryan's talking about or other people are talking about. Again, it's like trying to figure out what is it that we're buying and selling, who wants to buy and sell it, and are there enough of us to make it worthwhile? I put in one of my responses that like there are other conservation finance instruments that might be like lower hanging fruit And it might be these exact kind of payments for ecosystem services or payments for conservation actions. And maybe there's a way to bundle those and sell those. I don't know.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Fenichel, but I'll have one last question for both of you, and Dr. Fenichel, I would like you to go first. So, although the US offset market is large relative to other private investments in nature, the area covered or restored is tiny compared to parks and reserves. Are we hoping that the nature credit markets will have an impact at the larger scale? And so what do you think of compliance markets for dependencies rather than negative impacts?
So first, I want to push back on the premise of the comment or question. So what I would say is some of the USDA programs, like the CRP program, probably enrolls more land than at least national parks combined. Now, is that like full biodiversity conservation? No. Does it move agricultural lands that might have been more intensely used to slightly more mixed use? And so maybe there's some more birds and insects and things there? Yeah, probably. So I think we want to be careful about like imagining what we're talking about here. There are a lot of mixed use land programs, and I'm not sure that if you start comparing areas, that the premise there is exactly right. What was the second part of the question?
What do you think of compliance markets for dependencies rather than negative impacts?
So for a compliance market, you need the political will to establish the cap and either, basically a regulatory authority. I don't think it's happening in the United States anytime soon. I mean, just watching what's going on. I also don't think it's happening in Europe anytime soon. And I don't think it's happening in many countries at a large scale anytime soon. Because, governments don't really like rolling out large regulatory programs that are land use restrictive. Now, that said, one of the things that you have a lot of in places like the United States is you have a lot of conservation easements. And again, there might be a way to think about bundling those conservation easements and reselling them. And again, it's about distributing risk. So I've been, in my time at the White House and before and since, I've spent a lot of time in the space of like conservation biodiversity finance. And the thing is that finance is not about moving money around, it's about managing risks. And until we learn how to leverage the risk management tools that the finance people want to offer as conservationists, we're like leaving that the ability to expand on the table. We need to understand what risks are getting managed, how they can be shared, how we can redistribute those risks to create value. And if doing so can lead to conservation, we will fund conservation. I mean, it's like that simple. The problem right now is we don't actually, we're focusing too much on achieving the conservation rather than the risk management. So I think we're missing, I'm pretty confident we're missing some low-hanging fruits. I'm not convinced that that complicated biodiversity credit market, a singular biodiversity credit market is the way to go. I think there are certainly like very specific cases like the wetlands mitigation banks or whatnot where things can get built out. I think there are opportunities to potentially like pool those and create funds and portfolios that can be traded. But like, honestly, if we're worried about, I don't know, some set of species that are like just kind of there, like we don't know what their services are, we just people care about them. I think that's going to be a hard lift to say what risks are like conserving them de-risking. And we're going to need some philanthropy. The real reason I think to be focusing on these issues is I have a very real concern that we have a lot of philanthropy getting spent on things that could be financed, and therefore we don't have the philanthropy to spend it on the conservation that is like very, very pure public good. And it'll be harder to finance. So we really think about how we build that whole stack from private finance through concessionary finance to philanthropy, and making sure that the philanthropy isn't like oh, wow, because philanthropists have this incentive to be like, look at this great thing I did and all these livelihoods it increased and blah, 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 blah. But if it's increasing livelihoods, then like we should be able to figure out a way to finance that. But maybe there's a credit market failure and we need to deal with that too. But, that just means we're displacing funds out of the stack that aren't going to go to philanthropy. Like that should be like our last, those should be the hardest things, not the easiest.
Thanks, Dr. Fenichel. Ryan, I know you've already answered this in the Q&A feature, but can you quickly summarize what you put there?
Oh, this same question?
Yes.
Oh gosh, what did I say here? Sorry, just to review, I was scrambling here and replying to questions as a professor was responding. What was the question again?
So the question was, although the US offset market is large relative to other private investments in nature, the area covered or restored is tiny, that is compared to parks and reserves. We are hoping that the credit markets will have an impact on large scale. What do you think of compliance markets for dependencies rather than negative impacts?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, David, they're asking the question, not really comparing dependencies rather than impacts directly, but I would compare the two. I think the dependencies argument is legitimate. I think companies will, smart companies have always done this, treated dependencies as something they want to work on and invest in. And when they're smart, they would understand that they can do that related to biodiversity. I don't think that that is large enough to really make a huge dent in the problem, in part because it's just too easy for companies to externalize their impacts. They don't experience a direct feedback by creating conditions that mess up the resources that then they're dependent on, right? Rather than, say, associating with impact, which can be widespread, every single company has it. That's a harder kind of regulatory push. Some of the dependency argument is to say that, oh, hey, companies, this is in your best interest. But it's also in their financial interest to externalize things, which is partly why we're in the situation we're in, right? So I would say do dependencies, address that, invest in those areas where your company needs those resources. But impact and associating impact with uplift and trying to have a better sense of accounting for what our nature impacts and our uplift are, I think that's a better path and will lead to a much more widespread and more effective market.
Thank you so much, Ryan and Dr. Fenichel, for your presentations and also answering questions. Thank you to our audience for the questions. I believe we can go on and on, but unfortunately, we are at times. We would like to close with a few announcements. Admissions for our Tropical Forest Landscape Online Certificate Program is still open and is open until April 28th, 2025. If you have any questions about the program or the application process, you can visit our website or email us at tropicalcertificate@yale.edu. You can also visit the events page on our website, subscribe to our mailing list, and receive notifications on our upcoming events. You can visit our YouTube channel to watch other webinar series that we have up there. Next week is going to be very exciting because on next week, that is April 24th, we'll be joined by Dr. Florencia Montagnini, Senior Research Scientist at the Yale School of the Environment, and Toral Shah, Biodiversity Coordinator at Plan Vivo, to discuss monitoring and verification of biodiversity projects. So finally, on behalf of the webinar planning team, I would like to extend our utmost gratitude to our speakers and to Dr. Florencia Montagnini and Dr. David Myers for helping us identify speakers for this series. Visit our website or send us an email for more information. And I say thank you, take care, see you at the same time next week.